guys, it's Celestia, and as promised, today's video is a follow-up to one of my other recent videos, which was discussing censorship in art. Specifically, in that video, I was explaining some of the most common perspectives on whether or not there was any kind of art that warranted censorship and should not ever be posted, and whether or not art could do any kind of measurable harm to real people through influence alone. Amongst the three main topic examples I discussed in that video, perhaps the most controversial one was love. And it wasn't just controversial because of what it is. It was also controversial because it was the only example that I openly disavowed as being objectively bad and harmful in all instances of its existence, which was something that a lot of people took issue with. I received an overwhelming amount of feedback, some of which was constructive and thought-provoking, and some of which was vitriolic harassment, from people who did not like that I took such an anti-lolicon stance. After reading through all of it, I found that a lot of people were repeating a handful of very similar opinions and perspectives, and I decided that it would probably be best to do a video focusing specifically on clarifying my stance and addressing these main primary arguments that I'd been seeing so many of. As such, since shortly after that video's release, I have been compiling all of my resources, all of which are linked in the description, contacting professionals, and planning today's video with a great deal of detail and thorough examination of the topic. I aim to address not only the criticisms made against my stance on lolicon, but also the most prominent and frequently used defenses of lolicon. And I will do so by presenting a combination of my own experiences, thorough research and documentation, and a full interview with a mental health professional that I consulted for their educated stance on the matter. As such, here's the obligatory trigger warning because by very nature of the video, there are quite a few, including lolicon, obviously, CP, CSA, and grooming. Please click away now if you find any of those topics upsetting. So, first of all, I'd like to make my terminology abundantly clear so that you know exactly what I mean and don't mean when I refer to lolicon. Lolicon refers to art that depicts underage characters in sexual situations or in a sexualized manner, and technically only refers to girls, with the term shotacon being used for boys. For the duration of the video, I will be using lolicon as a blanket term to refer to both lolicon and shotacon, as gender has very little bearing on the fundamental nature of the issues I'll be discussing. Furthermore, I do not mean art in which the character's age is not the focus, in which the character's age is unclear, or in which the character has been aged up to an adult, which is its own can of worms that I'll open in another video. The art that I'm criticizing and disavowing is that which depicts underage characters being sexualized because of their age, not despite it or irrelevant to it, with their age being the primary focus and the thing that is intended to make them attractive to viewers. Now, to save time and avoid repeating myself, I'm gonna play the segment from my previous video where I discussed lolicon, including the points made both against it and in defense of it, as well as my personal opinions and conclusions, and then I'll move on to addressing the main criticisms that segment received. Alright, topic 2, lolicon. This one will be a lot more straightforward because I personally find lolicon thoroughly indefensible. And while I will present the arguments without that personal bias, my conclusion will be very, very easy to make. See, this topic is kind of my example of a way that art actually does consistently and objectively hurt people, and fiction actually does affect reality in a severe and significant way. Gave you a topic with a hard answer, now it's time to give you an easy one. So, to avoid focusing on the actual nature of this topic for too long, there will be no examples in this section and I will not be going into detail with my definition. Lolicon is art depicting intentionally and clearly underage characters in sexual situations, with that term specifying the character as female, while its alternative, shotacon, specifies the character as male. I am not talking about art of characters with undefined ages that look like they could potentially be young or underage. I am talking about art that depicts characters that are canonically and clearly underage, being sexualized specifically because they're underage. Now, I will not be discussing arguments that defend lolicon out of any genuine belief that it's good. We all know what kind of people make those arguments, and I'm not going to waste my time or any of yours by even mentioning any opinion that defends it for the sake of defending it. The absolute only arguments that I'll discuss here are arguments that effectively acknowledge that it's bad, but argue for its right to exist on the internet, or argue that it doesn't harm real children and it shouldn't be treated as equal to things that do harm real children. So the first such argument, as I alluded to, is that sexualizing children in art doesn't hurt real children. I think this argument is largely hinged on comparing it being depicted in art to it actually happening in real life, which is fair, but the argument against this is the fact that lolicon should be judged completely separately from any real-life equivalent. Just because something worse exists doesn't mean that lolicon isn't bad. And while obviously no children are harmed in the making of art, children are harmed by the fact that it exists. Lolicon and Shotacon actively and consistently make actual minors feel uncomfortable and unsafe, and the normalization of its content contributes to the actual sexualization of minors. Not only that, but while the creation of lolicon doesn't hurt children, the content itself only caters to one group of people, and catering to that group of people does do actual harm in and of itself. The other argument is that treating lolicon and Shotacon like a big issue that people should unite against detracts from things that are actively harming real children. Most of these arguments, I've found, come from pro-shippers who claim that being angry about the sexualization of fictional minors in art diminishes the severity of things that are harming real children, or takes attention away from them. I understand that this argument comes from a place of genuinely just wanting the best for real minors, and I can acknowledge and appreciate that. But the counter-argument is nonetheless valid, and it's that people can focus on two problems simultaneously, all the while realizing that one is more severe than the other, while still disavowing and despising both. It's another case of people unintentionally diminishing the significance and harm of lolicon because they're comparing it to a real-life equivalent, when they should instead just be seeing it as a separate issue. So in conclusion, yes, sexualizing actual children is worse than drawing sexualized art of fictional children. No, that does not mean that drawing sexualized art of fictional children is okay by any stretch of the imagination, or even vaguely justifiable or defensible. Its existence online does harm real children, it just harms them in a different way than a real-life equivalent would. So, that in mind, I'll now go over the biggest and loudest arguments against the points made in that segment, after which I will then address my responses to each one with both research and personal experiences. One of the biggest complaints I received was that I did not provide any proof that lolicon could do actual measurable harm to real children. And this is completely valid because I actively chose not to for two reasons. The first of which is that I thought going into further detail would serve only to unnecessarily trigger people given the nature of the detail. The second of which is that, quite frankly, I thought it was common sense. We'll get into that. Quick note, that passive aggression there was only directed at the people using my decision not to include that proof to say that proof didn't exist and that lolicon was fine. It's not directed at the people reasonably and fairly requesting those resources, who I hope to respectfully provide some clarity to with this video. The next criticism was that I asserted that vent art and pro-shipping, the other two examples used in the video to discuss censorship and morality, were nuanced issues that shouldn't be treated as black and white. But then I proceeded to treat lolicon as black and white, which they considered unfair and unreasonable. Next, many others criticized that I acknowledged that in the case of pro-shipping, the things people enjoy in fiction don't always reflect their real desires, but that I did not apply that same logic to lolicon. This next criticism pertained to the comparison of lolicon to actual CP. As I mentioned in that previous video, many people criticize those who are against lolicon for hurting real children, because their focus on denouncing the sexualization of fictional minors in media draws attention away from real CP and the exploitation of actual children. I argued that the problem there is that people shouldn't be looking at lolicon and CP as the same thing, or even on the same level, but rather as two things that are both bad separately. I posited that people could and should be mad at two things at once, while acknowledging that one was worse than the other, because they're two separate things and should be treated as such. I received some very reasonable feedback that the problem is that people are not doing that, and that disavowing lolicon so passionately and aggressively is ultimately resulting in people being angrier about fictional children being drawn sexually than they are about actual minors being harmed, even if that's not the intention when bringing attention to lolicon as a bad thing. Essentially, the failure to differentiate between lolicon and CP as separate issues has resulted in people taking the former way more seriously than the latter. And in my previous video, I did fail to acknowledge how serious of a problem that is. That said, I don't believe that this point requires a whole section later on to address it, because I don't think it'll take much time to sum up my response. Basically, I believe that while that's obviously true and a very serious problem, the solution isn't to suggest that people should be less angry about lolicon or less against it. I believe that the solution is for people to simply be angrier at CP and take it more seriously, while still maintaining an anti-lolicon stance. I can't stress enough that the differentiation between them is the most important thing, and that people should be angrier about CP than they should be about lolicon, but that should be achieved by staying angry about lolicon, and just being angrier and more vigilant about CP. Not dismissing the significance of lolicon to bring more attention to CP, when the same result could be achieved by simply bringing more attention to the latter alongside the lesser but nonetheless present attention being given to the former. For example, Thuman recently disavowed a lolicon manga on Twitter, and used that issue to promote an anti-CP charity focused on protecting real children. She took lolicon seriously as a bad thing, while also bringing attention and funds to a worse, separate but related thing. That, to me, is the ideal situation that should be strived for. Another Another argument I heard was that all art, regardless of its moral value, has a right to exist without being censored, and that's... honestly, in 99% of cases, I agree completely. Pondersprocket popped off about that, and I strongly agree with their takes, but I'll get into why I personally find this case to be the one exception to that later on. Next argument, people were not happy that I justified art that depicted minors sexually being posted in the form of vent art, but said it was not okay to post sexualized art of minors in any other situation. I'll be addressing this in a section discussing the moral difference between those two things, defined largely by the artist's motivations and the audience that they're deliberately targeting. Finally, the last criticism I heard a lot of was that I acknowledged that consuming violent media cannot make a non-violent person become violent if they didn't have those impulses prior to consuming that media, but didn't agree that the same could be said about lolicon. The people criticizing this also frequently posit, by extension, that saying people shouldn't enjoy, create, or circulate lolicon is the same as saying that people shouldn't make or play violent video games. This does not require its own section to address because the problem is right there in the criticism already. Violent media can only promote violence if the person consuming it was already violent, as I said, and therefore violent video games are not responsible for real violence. The only way they can influence a person to become violent is if that person was already inclined towards violence. That is not the case for lolicon. While violent media is not always consumed by violent people, lolicon is always consumed by people with pedophilic inclinations in one way or another. That means that 100% of the time it is influencing someone with existing predispositions towards children, and subsequently can only serve to do harm, as I'll explain further throughout the video. Alright, so one more note before I begin addressing these specific arguments. I'd just like to say that while I disagree with anyone defending lolicon in any capacity, I genuinely appreciate everyone who decided to voice their thoughts and opinions respectfully and constructively. I still strongly disagree with lolicon and the people who support it, now more than ever, but I also feel like it's important and valuable for everyone to feel comfortable discussing their views and perspectives on it, and I feel like I've personally developed a more well-defined perspective myself after listening to those of others. My stance hasn't changed, but my argument and worldview have both broadened and improved, and I think that's what's so valuable about open debate and discussion. I hope that in the following sections of this video, I'll be able to better communicate some more well-rounded and developed opinions and points. So let's start by addressing the criticism that I acknowledged that the things that people enjoy in fiction do not always reflect real desires, but I did not apply that to people who enjoy lolicon, and instead asserted that people who enjoy lolicon must always have some degree of sexual interest in real children. I stand by that differentiation wholeheartedly, but I also realize that I did fail to explain why, and I apologize for that. I intend to rectify that mistake here, and will be citing some of the resources linked in the description in the process, focusing majorly on an article by Christopher Bartel and Anna Cromaldi as I do so. Based on the nature of the arguments I'm about to present, this section will also be addressing people claiming that enjoying violent video games is the same as enjoying lolicon, as that's something that's covered quite succinctly by this section as well. Okay, so enjoying media depicting problematic subject matter does not always reflect real desires, and I stand by that stance while still disavowing lolicon as something that does, objectively, almost always reflect real desires. And to explain why, I'm going to try to summarize what the article "It's Just a Story" describes as fictive imagining. A great deal of the following will be a combination of direct quotes and simplified paraphrasing for the sake of comprehensibility, but if you would like a more detailed explanation, I would recommend reading the article yourselves. Additionally, throughout the entire duration of the video, I will be censoring a lot of the language used in the articles I cite to avoid demonetization. So similarly, while the articles may be triggering by way of the terminology used, I do recommend reading them yourself if you're comfortable with that kind of language and feel that reading it directly as it was written is valuable to you. Alright, so, fictive imagining. To quote from the article, the act of fictive imagining is characterized by a suspension of commitment to the truth of the imagined content. This concept is elaborated upon later in the article via the following, which should more directly clarify what that means. When we imagine, we entertain proposition X without being committed to proposition X being true or false, as this imagining does not exist within any reality or narrative beyond our own minds. By contrast, when we fictively imagine, we entertain proposition X as being true as represented in F referring to the fictional world that the imagining exists within. Artwork that prompts fictive imagining invites us to make believe that the contents of the fiction are true in some sense. Once engaged in the practice of fictive imagining, we are to obey its norms, one of which concerns inferences regarding the world. So basically, regular imagining exists outside of any connection to the real world because it does not take place in any world, fictional or real. Subsequently, the things imagined can be imagined without requiring us to apply the rules of any world to them. Conversely, fictive imagining, which is the kind of imagining prompted by our response to a piece of media, forces us to accept certain norms of the world in which that fiction takes place as being true, in a way that regular imagining does not. For example, I can sit here and imagine a dog eating a chocolate bar, and because that dog does not exist within any real or fictional world, that dog would be fine. In my head, he's actually having a really good time right now. If I were to instead imagine Marley from Marley and Me eating a chocolate bar, I would also by default have to acknowledge that Marley, as a dog conforming to that movie's fictional world that is subsequently allergic to chocolate, could easily get sick and die as a result of that chocolate bar. So in the first example, me enjoying imagining some random dog eating a Mars bar does not reflect a desire to see that dog get sick and die, because that dog exists outside of any world or universe in which it has to be allergic to chocolate. If I enjoyed the second example while knowing the consequences for Marley, that would reflect at the very least an ambivalence towards the dog's well-being, and at worst, a desire to see that dog suffer. The article uses a different example, and while it's a much more disturbing one, it's nonetheless relevant to discuss, as it segues into the connection to lolicon if you haven't gotten there already yet. I'm gonna have to censor this a lot to be able to talk about it, so I once again encourage you to read the article if you want clearer and more direct explanations of the example used, although I also warn you that it is likely to be upsetting. Essentially, the article cites a particular piece of media depicting a woman who does not consent to the intimate activities shown and actively says no, but in the end is still depicted as having enjoyed what happened. The article says as follows, paraphrased: one could argue that, in fantasizing about the events depicted in this media, one is fantasizing only about fictional non-con, and thus that the imaginative activity is not morally blameworthy. Yet, in response, it could be claimed that the imaginative activity is open to ethical assessment, whether one is disposed to act on such fantasies or not. One way to make this argument is to claim that works like this prompt their audiences to develop beliefs or attitudes in their fantasy lives. In this case, the belief that a woman would enjoyed that happening, but in doing so, they prompt beliefs and attitudes towards their real-life counterparts as well. In fantasizing about a fictional woman who would enjoy non-con, for example, one is applying an attitude to the woman in the fiction, but one is simultaneously expressing an attitude towards women as a kind. As Scott, and I really hope I pronounced that right because I'm gonna have to say it again, puts the objection. When the fantasist imagines his fictional women, he is imagining them as women. That is, as beings of a kind that exists in the real world. And that he imagines them as women is, of course, essential to his imaginative project. So all of that, put more simply, is effectively to say that were someone imagining non-con regularly, and not fictively imagining, it would have no implications about the way they viewed real women, because they are not imagining an actual woman. They're vaguely imagining the act in a world limited to their own mind. But by fictively imagining a woman in this situation as depicted by this media, this individual is conforming to the rules of the fictional world in which this woman represents an iteration or version of a real woman. And because the individual enjoys the media specifically because it's a woman being depicted, that does, by extension, force us to acknowledge that while the individual may not be inclined to support or even enjoy these events in reality, their enjoyment of it in this particular instance of fictive imagining must reflect certain beliefs and attitudes towards the real-life counterparts of the women in that media. And as I'm sure you can guess, that can easily be applied to children as well. If one is enjoying lolicon specifically because the character is a child within that fictional world, the act of fictive imagining forces us to acknowledge, by extension, that that individual has certain beliefs and attitudes towards real children, if the fantasy prompted by lolicon is only attractive to them because the character is a child. Which is, as Scott put it, a being of a kind that exists in the real world. And the fantasy requires the character to be that being of a kind that exists in the real world in order for that fantasy to be appealing. It's at this point that I'd like to address the point that this logic could also apply to pro-shipping, which brings me back to the criticism I received, that I acknowledge that in the case of pro-shipping, fantasizing about inappropriate or unacceptable relationships, so long as they didn't involve minors, did not always reflect real desires, but I did not extend this to lolicon. Again, I stand by that, and here's why. Let's go back to that previous example of the non-con porn and discuss the hypothetical individual enjoying it. If this individual is enjoying the media because they enjoy the thought of doing that to a woman specifically, I would assert that based on our understanding of fictive imagining, that would indeed reflect the way they actually see real women, as the fantasy is dependent on the fictional woman being involved. But that is not the only reason a person might enjoy that media. Conversely, if that individual doesn't care about the gender of the person in that media at all, their enjoyment of it obviously wouldn't reflect any real views on women. Instead, they could be motivated by a desire for the act, for the situation, for the dynamic. There are a plethora of reasons that could motivate the individual that do not have anything to do with the woman, or, by extension, their views about women. Similarly, in the case of someone enjoying violent video games, there are a plethora of reasons that a person could derive enjoyment from that do not reflect any real desire to hurt others, nor does it make people violent. But in the case of Lolicon, at least as long as there is no scenario involved in it and it's exclusively the character that's the subject of the fantasy, there is no other possible motivation for the individual enjoying it to enjoy it, because the only thing drawing them to that media is the age of the character. There is nothing else about the media that could appeal to them aside from the age, and by the nature and rules of fictive imagining, that does reflect the individual's views on real children. I didn't say that the things pro-shippers enjoyed in media could never reflect real desires, but rather that they did not always reflect them by default, and that's based on this logic. And similarly based on this logic, I feel confident in my assertion that enjoying Lolicon does always reflect them by default. I hope this more detailed explanation was able to bring some much-needed clarification to those assertions. Now, delving further into some of the other arguments with that explanation as our foundation, others claim that even if enjoying Lolicon did reflect real desires and views towards real children, it still did not do harm by existing and being posted and shared, because it still couldn't harm real children. I'll go into the other ways that it can do harm to real children in more detail a bit later on in its own section, but I'd also like to acknowledge this particular way here, because the article does a great job of explaining it. It posits that active fantasy can influence an individual's real views over time if those fantasies are indulged through media. It also explains, effectively, why even fantasizing about underage characters without any intention to act on those fantasies is still morally reprehensible. To elaborate further, I'd like to return to that article and read you guys some more of it, again with the necessary paraphrasing and censoring. An individual's fantasies play some distinctive role in that individual's mental life. Our fantasies are often, but not always, indicative of our desires. Sometimes we desire things that would be immoral to pursue in real life. Actively fantasizing about something that is desired can aid in the cultivation of that desire, and there are some desires that it would be immoral to cultivate. When consuming porn, an individual does not merely entertain fictive imaginings. The individual's desires are also engaged. An individual may use porn as a way of satisfying an immoral desire, and by satisfying it, one may further cultivate that desire. First, it is important to clarify what kind of fantasies we're talking about. We are not categorically criticizing all fantasies. Many of our fantasies are beyond our control. Sometimes we engage in fantasy passively. Think of those cases where a thought arrives unbidden and sometimes unwelcome. Such passive fantasies are involuntary. Alternatively, active fantasies are voluntary. They are imagined scenarios that we return to time and time again determinedly. These are the stories that we deliberately tell ourselves, the fantasies we develop, refine, and relish, ones that take up a significant portion of our imaginative mental lives. There is a morally relevant difference between active and passive fantasies. For instance, it would be one thing to passively entertain a fantasy about an acquaintance, but it's another thing to will that fantasy to mind. The core of our argument hinges on three claims: that porn engages the consumer's desires as well as their imagination, that some desires are immoral, and that it is immoral to cultivate such desires through fantasy. Beginning with that first claim, consider what is involved with one's engagement with porn. Understood that the appreciation of fiction requires the consumer to engage imaginatively with it, thereby treating the scenarios depicted within it as true within fiction. By contrast, porn calls for more than imaginative engagement. When consuming it, one is not simply entertaining a fiction, rather one is getting off on it, and that is the wording used in the article. Appreciating porn requires one to not only imaginatively engage with that content of work, but to also find that content attractive. When it comes to the extent to which what one finds attractive reflects their desires, much could be said. But we could at least say that this media typically aims to appeal to the consumer's desires for a reason. Turning to the second claim, we must ask, are some desires immoral to hold even when those desires are not acted on outside of fantasy? There is some reason to believe so. Consider a person who holds racist beliefs but never acts upon them. Imagine that it is simply a matter of moral luck that this person lives in such a closed society that they never find themselves in a situation where they may act on their racist beliefs. Regardless of this contingency, it is still morally wrong for someone to hold racist beliefs. The same could be said of desires. Pedophilia is a bad desire to have, even if one does not act on it. An individual would be better off, morally speaking, without with such desires. One might then wonder what kind of moral theory is required to justify the claim that desires are immoral. It would be beyond the scope of this essay to take up this issue in much detail. However, we suspect that this claim can be defended by any number of theories. For instance, some consequentialists might argue that the possession of an immoral desire by an individual unacceptably raises that individual's risk to perform such acts. Deontologists, and I hope I pronounced that right, might argue that immoral desires diminish our capacity to treat others with respect. Virtue ethicists might argue that the individual's possession of an immoral desire is damaging to their moral character. It is sufficient for our purposes to say that the morality of desire is not implausible, although it may be an underexplored area of ethical theory. Some might object that it is better to satisfy an immoral desire in fantasy than in reality, so individuals should not be held morally blameworthy for fantasizing about immoral things. This objection may seem intuitive, but it is weak. It shifts the focus of the argument from the cultivation of immoral desires to their satisfaction. We are not so much worried about finding out what is the best way to satisfy an immoral desire. Instead, we are interested in cautioning against the cultivation of immoral desires. Even if it is better for an individual to satisfy an immoral desire in fantasy than reality, we can still maintain that it's morally wrong to cultivate an immoral desire. Basically, simply put, one thing being worse doesn't mean the first thing isn't bad. Moving on to the last section, the article continues. We can now turn to our third claim, that it's morally wrong to cultivate immoral desires through fantasy. When we say that a desire can be cultivated, we suggest that desires can be reinforced and refined by seeking out the desired contents. Aestheticians are well aware that one's taste in art, or food, or drink, or whatever, can be cultivated and changed through practice. We suggest that desires can be cultivated the same way. Classical conditioning suggests an obvious psychological mechanism for the cultivation of a desire. If the engagement with some content is consistently rewarded with pleasure, then the association between pleasure and that content is reinforced. Which is basically to say that if the content is immoral, cultivating an association between that content and pleasure is, in and of itself, immoral. Which is further to say that enjoying lolicon serves to further reinforce a pedophilic desire, which is already a form of harm done to real children, because reinforcing desires increases the risk of people possessing those desires acting on them in reality. For anyone interested, both the article and this video's resources provide empirical evidence of the link between frequent indulgence in immoral sexual fantasies and an increase in actual real crimes against the victims being fantasized about. Furthermore, the article goes on to say the following. Lietenberg and Henning report that most treatment programs for sex offenders to directly modify fantasies. This is telling. If fantasies can be modified, then this result must be achieved through the cultivation of another desire. Moreover, if porn can be used to positively modify the fantasies of some, then why should we not think that it can't also negatively modify the fantasies of others? Put simply, there is objective proof that media can influence and change our desires, as well as our risk of indulging those desires. Subsequently, there is proof that lolicon can influence and worsen the pedophilic inclinations of those who enjoy it, and thereby increase their risk of hurting real children. Alright, so the next criticism I want to go over is why I believe that even morally bad art should not be censored, but still simultaneously believe that lolicon should be. First of all, I would strongly recommend watching Ponder Sprocket's video on the topic of censorship, linked in the card above, and reading the article, The Ethical Criticism of Art, linked in the description. The former presents a very comprehensive defense of why even immoral or offensive art has a right to exist without being censored, and the latter provides a succinctly, clearly worded summary of the relationship between morality and art. I'm referring you to both because, with the one single exception of lolicon and other art that depicts children for the explicit purpose of appealing to people attracted to that, I agree completely that no art should be censored, morally bad or not. Because as I said in my previous video, morality cannot be quantifiably measured, as it's a concept that does not have one single definition, but is rather defined by each individual's personal perception and understanding of it. But lolicon is different, at least from my perspective, and I'd like to refer back to the It's Just a Story article to explain why. The article informs us that for a brief period of time, computer-generated CP was protected under the First Amendment as free speech in the United States, based on the same argument that so many people are using to defend lolicon, that no real children were harmed in its making. While there has been a great deal of debate and inconsistency surrounding the illegality of this since then, the research that I found states that it is no longer protected under the First Amendment. The article posits this stance as why. Perhaps it is true that for some individuals, the things they find attractive in fiction are unrelated to their real-world desires. But it is also true that many do turn to computer-generated CP to feed a real-world desire desire and thereby refine their tastes. God, I hate that sentence. So while we accept that an individual may desire something in fiction that they would not desire in reality, we reject the stronger claim that acts of fictive imagining are always sufficiently bracketed out from the individual's real-world desires and beliefs. When an individual engages in an act of imagining to cultivate an immoral desire, then that individual's act of imagining should be open to moral scrutiny, as their imaginative engagement is not genuinely bracketed out from their real-world desires. That alone should be enough to communicate why I believe that lolicon should fall under the reasonable scrutiny of censorship. Even the law says that fictional images depicting children, even when they're not real children and no real children were harmed in their making, that's potentially dangerous enough of its own merit by appealing to the desires of predators and allowing them to cultivate those desires. Finally, last section before I tackle the biggest section of how lolicon harms real children, is why vent art is different than lolicon when it comes to the significance of the artist's intention. Again, I'm going to refer back to a section of the article, which is as follows. Is it ever wrong for an artist to prompt their audience to fictively imagine something immoral? Others believe that it can only be wrong when the artist intends for their fictional work to promote or justify the real-world equivalent. But we offer an extension to that. Artists can both be held morally responsible for prompting their audience intentionally to fictively imagine something immoral, when they have a reasonable expectation that their audience will derive a real-world belief or desire from it. But they should also be held responsible for when their work is made and shared in such a way that, whether intentionally or not, it allows the audience to use the work to cultivate an immoral desire. Our account aims to capture two sorts of cases. Those cases where the artist intends for their audience to use their work to cultivate an immoral desire, and those cases where the artist neglects to guard against such uses of their work. In our view, many works are morally problematic simply because of their negligence. First, consider what our account allows us to say about the case of computer-generated CP. The producers of this content are morally at fault because their intention is for their audience to derive beliefs about what is appropriate regarding the treatment of real children from their media. The producers of such work aim for it to be attractive to consumers, and whether those producers find it attractive themselves or not is irrelevant. All that's relevant is that the work's producers had the belief that its contents would be attractive to its target audience. Finally, our account allows us to avoid excessive moralizing. For instance, consider Nabokov's Lolita, which has been widely praised for its success in presenting the character of Humbert Humbert in a sympathetic light. As a work of literature, it is reasonable to expect that wrestling uncomfortably with such sympathy is the artistic aim of the work, and success in this regard counts as a literary success. Of course, this does not preclude the possibility that some readers might ignore the work's psychological depth, and superficially read only the racy parts for their own pleasure. In this case, the reader can be held morally responsible for their use of the work to cultivate an immoral desire. But these readers are atypical, and are not treating the work as Nabokov intended. Subsequently, while those readers are morally wrong, Nabokov should not be held responsible for those atypical readers. I'm quoting this section to attempt to use those differences in situations to illustrate the difference between lolicon and vent art. In the instance of lolicon, the artist either knows that they're catering to predators, or they're simply failing to realize that their work will cater to predators, and they're to blame in either case. In the instance of vent art, the artist's intention is to only appeal to others who are dealing with what they have, and will interpret the work for what it is, a way to cope with trauma, and not something that is attractive. Even if some viewers do use vent art to cultivate immoral desires, as the article would word it, they are atypical viewers, and subsequently, the artist should not be blamed for their failure to view the work as what it is. And that brings us, finally, to the biggest question. Does lolicon harm real children, even if its creation does not? Well, so far we've already discussed some of the biggest ways. There is documented and very readily available proof that cultivating pedophilic desires is not only immoral, but it can empirically and objectively lead to an increased risk of people who consume lolicon content pursuing those desires in real life. That in and of itself is harmful to real children. But it's easy to hear that from a study or an article, or see it represented through statistics and evaluation. It's harder to dismiss from actual sources. And that brings me to something that's harder for me to talk about, that I never wanted to talk about in the first place, but apparently I have to. And that's my groomer. In a very old story time with embarrassingly bad audio and art, linked in the card above, I shared my experience with a 24-year-old man who manipulated me into a romantic and sexual relationship, starting when I was 13 and ending when I was 14. I described the experience in a flippant and borderline sarcastic way as a method of coping. But the bottom line is that it was traumatizing, and this man groomed and abused me. More relevantly, he justified doing so by citing lolicon. He would send me manga and doujinshi depicting very, very underage girls with grown men and used it to convince me that our relationship, if I can even call it that, was okay. Just because some people go their whole lives enjoying lolicon without ever abusing a real child does not negate the fact that lolicon can, objectively and quantifiably, influence real human beings to abuse children, and it very frequently does. I am walking proof that it does. When I say that lolicon normalizes and justifies the sexualization of real minors, I am not talking out of my ass. I am speaking from the perspective of someone whose groomer, who was actively sexualizing me, aggressively and persistently when I was very much a minor, and because I was a minor, he literally told me that that type of media reassured him that his desires were normal. He used that media to justify desires that he may not otherwise have ever acted on. But my personal experience probably won't even be enough for many of you, so let's get into the interview portion. I reached out to a mental health professional who has requested to remain anonymous, because I wanted to cover all of my bases with these takes and not just rely on existing articles. Instead, I wanted a qualified professional's take on this very specific instance, and I'm incredibly grateful to them for providing it. This individual has almost 30 years of experience as a therapist, a master's degree in psychology, and is a certified social worker. They have worked with both offenders and victims, and they have studied both extensively. They were given the same description of lolicon and the nuances of it that was given at the beginning of this video, and they were given no information as to my own personal stance to preserve objectivity and an unbiased perspective. Our interview is as follows, with distortion for anonymity's sake. Is there any reason that an individual would enjoy media depicting an underage fictional character in a sexual situation that does not reflect pedophilic inclinations?
From an ethical and moral position, as well as from a child development, psychological, and law enforcement perspective, I would suggest that it would be deemed pedophilic to be viewing sexualized art of underage children, perhaps even to be creating it if it is posted somewhere for all to see. It is a very slippery slope and a very concerning one. As a therapist who has been working with children and youth for over 28 years, I've been witness to the damage that's been done to children who have been exposed to sexualized art, as well as those who have been sexually abused. It would perpetrate an already existing epidemic. Those keen to view fictional art eroticizing children is a big red flag.
Would you consider an individual who enjoys art of fictional underage characters depicted sexually to be a pedophile?
Pedophile is a strong term with a clear definition: a person sexually attracted to children. My query is, what is the individual gleaning from sexualized art of children specifically? I am hard-pressed to understand. If they are not sexually attracted to children, why would they not instead enjoy something similar of adults? Why children? Why is it specifically about children expressed sexually in art that is appealing? I think the answer is right there. I would posit that it is the children specifically that draws them into the enjoyment. Thus, it begs one to question, are they then a pedophile?
Do you believe that the creation and circulation of this art does measurable harm to actual children, even if the characters depicted are fictional and not real children themselves?
I do. It perpetuates the eroticization of children and also has a strong possibility of causing more trauma and damage to children who have been sexually abused or assaulted, in addition to the possibility of putting other children at risk. It would give children the message that they are not valued, not safe, and are objects to be used sexually rather than little humans who have the basic and essential right to be safe and secure in this world and to maintain their innocence. So yes, immeasurable harm. It also has the potential to re-traumatize adults who have been sexually abused as children and had to overcome those assaults against them.
If the person creating sexualized art of fictional children is a victim of CSA themselves, do you believe that them enjoying and creating this media is a valid coping mechanism?
Art for therapy purposes can have significant value for healing. It's circulating that art that is the concern. For those healing from childhood sexual abuse through art, the tendency of the individual is not to have that made public and shown to the world. It is typically a very private process for them to work out and is loaded with emotions, thoughts, and struggles that are too broad to mention here. It is a private process if used in this way, and those that have experienced childhood abuse would understand how making this public and accessible to anyone would be damaging not only to them, but to all children and adults with that history in multiple catastrophic ways. Or I would hope that they would understand. If that is not the case, I would suggest that their healing and understanding of what happened to them is not fully integrated.
If the person creating sexualized art of fictional characters is not a victim of CSA themselves, do you believe that there is any justifiable reason for them to enjoy and create this media?
I struggle to find a way to justify this art otherwise. I would be concerned and would wonder what is motivating that individual. I'm looking at this as a therapist and not through the lens of an artist. It again becomes a very significant moral, ethical, and legal issue in my mind. The question keeps coming up: why children?
Do you believe that the sexualization of fictional children in art could lead to the normalization and acceptance of actual children in reality?
Yes. It absolutely perpetrates an already tragic existing problem, gives others permission to do so, normalizes it, and completely devalues the innocence and safety of children, putting them at increased risk. It can also be very re-traumatizing for children who have been victimized. The risk is tremendous for normalization and acceptance of this horrific assault on children.
Do you believe that this type of art should be allowed to exist on the internet?
100% no, it should not. The internet is now where predators lurk the most and is used to groom children. Furthermore, children are learning younger and younger how to access the internet and are very savvy at finding all sorts of things. The potential damage to them coming across this type of media is tremendous. We all have a responsibility in our society, regardless of our passions, freedom of speech and expression, etc., to keep our children safe.
Many justify the enjoyment of this content as paraphilia. Do you agree with this?
One of the key elements in the term paraphilia is that it pertains to mature, consenting partners. Children are not mature, and they are not consenting. Additionally, they are considered to be too young to consent if given the option. Paraphilia is also considered an intense and persistent sexual interest. Intense and persistent sexual interest clearly shows it is not just for the enjoyment of art. It is the sexual pleasure they receive from art of sexualized children. I think that says it all.
Thank you again to this individual for their educated insight, as I feel that this video would not have been thorough or complete without the input of a professional on this specific circumstance. I sincerely hope that this video was able to provide an adequate, thorough, and detailed follow-up to my initial video, as I do recognize that I did gloss over the topic of Volcon despite having the resources not to. I will not make that mistake again in the future. I understand that many potential viewers may disagree, but I truly believe that I have done the utmost research into this topic, and I don't believe that there is anything any of them can present at this point that would change my view of Volcon. I also believe that anyone who supports the sexualization of children in media of any kind, specifically because those characters are children and not despite the fact that they're children, I don't believe they're someone I want to have a conversation with. I'm not saying that people sexualizing underage characters despite the fact that they're children are fine, but they're not who I'm referring to in this video, although I may revisit that specific subgroup in the future. Thank you for watching, and I hope the video was adequately informative. I'll be back next week with some exciting contests, sponsors, updates, and announcements, in addition to some less heavy content, so I'll see you guys then.